Breaking overnight, disturbing details, a new jolt to President-elect Donald Trump's defense secretary pick, as Politico puts it this morning. For the first time, we are now seeing the police report at the center of a sexual assault allegation against Pete Hegseth. With Hegseth's nomination already facing scrutiny, the report in graphic detail now reveals conflicting accounts of what happened in a hotel room 7 years ago. Sarah Murney has been pouring through the 22 pages of this police report, and you lead us off this morning. What are the details that you are hearing, knowing that they are...
Yeah, it is disturbing. And, this police report really does give conflicting accounts of what happened this evening in October of 2017 in California surrounding a Republican women's conference. And I want to get to the woman's account first. She's referred to as Jane Doe in this police report. She says she encountered Hegseth at this conference. He was giving off a creeper vibe. She says she ends up in a strange hotel room, and when she's there, Hegseth took her phone from her hands.
What's happening, people? Welcome to Dr. John Podcast again. Despite wild online rumors of a sealed verdict against Trump, the actual story is different. A federal judge issued a blistering 29-page ruling quoting Bob Dylan while blocking the Pentagon's attempt to punish a senator for telling troops they can refuse illegal orders. The real drama involving censorship, retaliation, and constitutional overreach is more shocking than the fiction. Senator Mark Kelly, who spent years serving this country as a Navy captain and later as an astronaut, joined several other Democratic veterans in Congress to record a simple message. It was a basic reminder about rights that service members already possess under long-standing military law. Within 1 week, the Pentagon opened what they called a formal review into serious allegations of misconduct. Then Hegseth issued a formal letter of censure and threatened to reduce Kelly's military retirement rank.
And he blocked the door with his body. She went on to say she remembered saying no a lot. Now, there was a lot she couldn't recall, and she said she believed something may have been slipped into her drink, although there were other witnesses who said when they saw her, she did not seem to be overly intoxicated. There were also conflicting accounts from witnesses at this conference about an interaction that this woman had with Hegseth at a bar at the hotel. One person said that Hegseth was hitting on another woman, and Jane Doe arrived to be a, quote, crotch blocker to stop him from hitting on this other lady. A different conference attendee said it appeared that Jane Doe and another woman were flirting with Hegseth. At any rate, a few days after this incident took place in the hotel room, Jane Doe does go to seek medical attention. She gets a rape kit. She tells the hospital that she's not sure if there was any penetration, but she believes that she was sexually assaulted. And then a nurse there reports it to authorities. Now, this is a very different account than what Pete Hegseth gave to authorities. He describes an evening of consensual sexual intercourse,
which would have meant slashing his pension. And he didn't stop there. He also raised the possibility of criminal prosecution. The word he used to describe Kelly's statement was seditious. Let that land for a moment. The Secretary of Defense called a sitting senator's reminder of existing military law an act of sedition. And it wasn't just Hegseth acting alone on this. The president himself went even further. Donald Trump publicly accused the Democrats in that video of seditious behavior that he said was punishable by death. Think about the gravity of that statement. The president of the United States suggested that elected senators, people who served their country in uniform, deserve the death penalty for telling troops they have the right to refuse an illegal order, something that has been settled law in this country for decades, something that military lawyers have been teaching service members for generations. The commander-in-chief publicly used the word death in connection with members of Congress, simply repeating existing legal doctrine.
He says that this woman, Jane Doe, ends up in his hotel room. He found it kind of odd that she stuck around, but they became intimate. And he tells authorities there was always conversation and always consensual conduct. He said that he and Jane Doe discussed that she was married, and she said she would tell her husband she had fallen asleep on the couch in someone else's room. He also told authorities she showed early signs of regret, although he didn't describe what that means. Now, Timothy Parlatore, an attorney for Hegseth, said that this police report confirms what I've said all along, that the incident was fully investigated and police found the allegations to be false, which is why no charges were filed. Now, we do have to note the police report does not say that these allegations are false. It is true that there are no charges that were filed in this case, and there is other other evidence that could help shed light on what happened. There's surveillance video. There's a memo from the district attorney's office that would kind of outline why they decided not to bring charges in this case. Those have not been released, and we don't expect them to be released. Authorities have cited state law saying that they're going to remain private.
Whatever you think about the politics involved here, that kind of rhetoric aimed at sitting senators is genuinely unprecedented. It's the kind of escalation that would have been unthinkable in any previous administration. This entire saga began with something so simple, it's almost absurd when you think about it. Senator Kelly, who has actual combat experience and understands military culture from the inside, recorded a message reminding service members of their rights. He wasn't encouraging insubordination. He wasn't suggesting troops ignore lawful orders. He was stating something that has been consistently upheld by military courts and legal experts for decades. The Uniform Code of Military Justice itself recognizes that service members have an obligation to refuse orders that are unlawful. This is not controversial among military lawyers. It's not disputed by legal scholars. It's foundational to how the American military operates. And yet, this simple, straightforward statement triggered a response that included threats of demotion, pension cuts, criminal charges, and public accusations of sedition.
We should also note that earlier, Parlatore, the Hegseth attorney, did say that his client paid a settlement, an undisclosed sum, to this woman, and there was a confidentiality clause as part of this. The woman did not comment to CNN. When we contacted her last week, she did break down in tears.
Sarah Murray, a lot of complications there, a lot of different sides of that story, but the detail is disturbing in and of themselves. Appreciate it. Kate?
And we are standing by, Sarah, today to see Pete Hegseth on Capitol Hill with J.D. Vance at his side. And also standing by to see what key Republican senators think about his nomination after they hear from him, and also see the new details about the alleged sexual assault that he denies happened. CNN's Elena Treen has new reporting on this today for us. She's back with us. Elena, what are you learning?
Well, first of all, I think today is really a key test, both for Hegseth, who, of course, is going to be confronted with a lot of what Sarah just laid out, a lot of Republicans in the Senate who are going to be vital to ensuring whether or not Hegseth can get confirmed. They're really going to have to see whether or not they are comfortable with having him serve as the head of the Department of Defense. So it's a big test for him. It's also a big test, of course, though.
Senator Kelly didn't back down. He sued Hegseth directly, along with the Department of Defense, the Navy, and Navy Secretary John Phelan. His legal argument was clear and compelling. The entire censure and demotion effort violated his First Amendment rights. He was a sitting United States senator exercising his constitutional duties, including oversight of the military. And the retaliation he faced for protected political speech was an attack on the Constitution itself. When the case reached the courtroom, Judge Richard Leon, who was appointed by President George W. Bush, didn't mince words. He sided completely with Kelly, issuing a preliminary injunction that blocked the Pentagon from punishing him in any way. Now here's the question that should be on everyone's mind. Is this really about some hidden sealed verdict against Trump? Or is the actual story something far more significant? Because when you strip away the dramatic fiction circulating online, what remains is a federal judge delivering one of the most direct judicial rebukes of a sitting cabinet secretary in recent memory. A judge saying in plain language that the Pentagon had trampled on a senator's constitutional freedoms.
For J.D. Vance, he has been tasked directly by Donald Trump to bring some of these controversial nominees or potential nominees and appointees to the Hill to have these meetings with these key senators. And really, whether or not Donald Trump can get his preferred cabinet picks confirmed is really going to be a test of J.D. Vance's influence. And what we've learned in some of our new reporting today is that Donald Trump has directly asked J.D. Vance to kind of be his point person on Capitol Hill. Yes, he has others who are going to be officially named as the liaison to Congress, but J.D. Vance has been someone that he has asked directly to, one, help him with these cabinet picks, but also to ensure that they stand behind him on a lot of his agenda. Donald Trump firmly believes that he has a mandate that he was given. Other people question if that's true because he had won the popular vote and because of the results of the election. And he wants J.D. Vance to make sure that now that they have majorities in the House and the Senate, that they move forward with what Donald Trump wants to do and don't get in Donald Trump's way. So this is a a test of that. And we also saw that, of course, yesterday when Vance kind of paraded Matt Gaetz through the Senate halls as well for these important meetings. And all to say as well, I think when it really comes down to it, there's a lot of questions about, whether some of these nominees, whether Matt Gaetz or Hegseth, could kind of be viewed as the sacrificial lamb. I've heard some people argue that perhaps
a judge quoting Bob Dylan to make his point. That's not a minor bureaucratic dispute. That's not some procedural footnote. That's a federal court declaring that the Secretary of Defense violated the Constitution, and that deserves way more attention than it's getting. Think about what Hegseth was actually trying to accomplish here. He was attempting to use the machinery of the Pentagon to punish an elected official for speech he disagreed with. He wasn't responding to a security breach or a violation of military regulations. He was responding to words that were perfectly legal, words that were absolutely protected by the First Amendment, words that any American citizen has the right to say, let alone a sitting senator doing his job. The fact that he thought he could get away with this tells you something about the culture at the top of the Pentagon. The fact that a federal judge had to step in and stop it tells you something about how far the boundaries were being pushed. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because there was a second legal defeat for the administration that happened within days of Judge Leon's ruling, something that barely got covered but is equally significant. Prosecutors in Washington, D.C. actually tried to get a federal grand jury to indict Kelly and fellow Senator Alyssa Slotkin on criminal charges of seditious conspiracy, the same exact behavior, the same video, the same underlying allegations, and the grand jury refused to indict them. Think about that for a second. Grand juries are notorious for indicting almost anyone prosecutors bring before them. There's a saying in legal circles that you can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich if you really want to. But in this case, faced with charges against two sitting senators for the same speech that had already triggered the Pentagon's disciplinary machinery, the grand jury said no. That's not a small detail. That's a signal that even a body designed to side with prosecutors found the case too weak to move forward. That's two separate legal defeats in two different arenas within a span of 48 hours, both stemming from the same underlying attempt to punish protected political speech. The administration lost in court before a federal judge, and they lost before a grand jury. If you're keeping score at home, that's 0 for 2 on trying to silence Senator Kelly. And the timing of these defeats matters too. The grand jury declined to indict just 2 days before Judge Leon's ruling came down. It suggests that the legal theory underlying the entire effort was so weak that multiple institutions rejected it independently of each other. Let's slow down and actually walk through what Judge Leon found in his ruling, because the language he used was extraordinarily direct for a federal judicial opinion. These documents are typically written in careful, measured prose designed to withstand appellate review. But Leon didn't hold back. He wrote that the court had all it needs to conclude that defendants have trampled on Senator Kelly's First Amendment freedoms and threatened the constitutional liberties of millions of military retirees. That's not cautious hedge language. That's a federal judge stating plainly that Hegseth's actions violated the Constitution and that the harm extended far beyond just Kelly personally. The judge recognized that every single retired service member in the country had a stake in this case. Every veteran who might one day want to speak out on matters of public concern. Every retired officer who might have something to say about military policy. They all had a constitutional interest in seeing the Pentagon's overreach stopped. Leon specifically rejected the government's core legal argument, and it's worth understanding exactly what that argument was. Hegseth's legal team tried to claim that active duty military members have somewhat reduced First Amendment protections because of the need for discipline and obedience within the armed forces. And they argued that this same reduced protection should extend to retired service members too, even ones serving in Congress. This is a breathtakingly broad assertion. It would mean that anyone who ever served in the military would have fewer constitutional rights than other citizens for the rest of their lives. It would mean that a retired general or admiral couldn't criticize the president without facing potential punishment. It would mean that veterans who enter public life would carry a permanent legal disability that their civilian counterparts don't share. Leon completely dismantled that argument. He wrote that no court had ever extended those principles to retired service members, and certainly not to one who was serving in Congress and exercising oversight responsibility over the military. In plain language, Kelly wasn't just some retired officer running his mouth. He was a sitting United States senator doing his actual constitutional job. He had a duty to oversee the military as part of his elected responsibilities. And the idea that the Pentagon could use its disciplinary authority to punish him for performing that oversight duty was constitutionally absurd. The judge made clear that the First Amendment protections that apply to all Americans apply equally to senators who happen to be military retirees. Here's a detail that genuinely captures how forcefully Leon rejected the government's position. When Hegseth's legal team argued that a district court judge wasn't even competent to decide these issues, insisting military personnel decisions were exempt from judicial review entirely, Leon rejected that too. He made clear that the courts absolutely retain authority to review constitutional violations like this one. The Pentagon doesn't get to operate as a law unto itself. The Constitution applies to the military, just as it applies to every other branch of government. And when the military violates someone's constitutional rights, the courts have the power and the duty to step in. That's not just a legal principle. That's foundational to how our system of checks and balances is supposed to work. And Leon didn't stop at just the legal reasoning either. He included some genuinely pointed commentary, the kind you don't often see in formal court opinions. He quoted Bob Dylan, writing that you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. The reference essentially suggested that the unconstitutional nature of Hegseth's actions was obvious to anyone paying attention. He wasn't saying this was a close call or a difficult question. He was saying that the constitutional violation was so clear that no expert analysis was even needed. He added that America's retired veterans deserve more respect from their government and that the Constitution demands they receive it. That's about as direct a moral rebuke as a federal judge typically delivers in an official written ruling. He wasn't just ruling against the administration. He was dressing them down. There's another detail worth understanding about why this case reached beyond just Kelly personally. The court considered a friend of the court brief filed by former high-ranking military officials. These were people who had served at the highest levels and understood the military culture intimately. They warned that many current service members were already declining to speak publicly on matters of genuine public importance, not because they didn't have valuable perspectives to share, not because they didn't want to contribute to national debates, but because they were afraid. They had seen what happened to Kelly, and they didn't want the same thing to happen to them. Leon called that chilling effect, quote, a troubling development in a free country. That's exactly the kind of broader systemic harm First Amendment law is specifically designed to prevent. It's not just about punishing one person's speech. It's about creating a climate where an entire category of people become too afraid to speak at all. When the government can punish one person for saying something, everyone else who might want to say something similar has to think twice. And that's precisely what the First Amendment is supposed to protect against. The government doesn't have to silence everyone to effectively suppress speech. It just has to silence enough people that the rest become afraid. Leon recognized that dynamic and made clear that it couldn't be allowed to stand. Now, how did Hegseth actually respond to losing this ruling? This is where things get particularly revealing. He didn't acknowledge any of the legal reasoning. He didn't engage with the constitutional analysis. He didn't show any sign that he had learned anything from the experience. Instead, he posted on social media that the ruling would be immediately appealed, and then he doubled down entirely, writing that sedition is sedition, Captain, a direct personal jab at Kelly's former military rank. The Secretary of Defense responded to a federal judge's detailed 29-page constitutional analysis by repeating the exact same accusation that the judge had just rejected. That's not the behavior of someone who cares about getting the law right. That's the behavior of someone who's more interested in messaging than in legal substance. Kelly's own response after the ruling is worth hearing too, because it captures what he says was actually at stake here. He said this administration was sending a message to millions of retired veterans that they too could be censured or demoted just for speaking out, and that's exactly why he said he couldn't let it stand. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every veteran who might one day want to exercise their constitutional rights. He later added after the ruling came down that a federal court made clear Hegseth violated the Constitution when he tried to punish him for something he said, and he noted that he suspected this fight wasn't actually over yet. In his words, Trump and Hegseth can't admit when they are wrong. Kelly's background actually makes this case even more significant when you sit with it for a moment. This isn't some outside political activist with no military credibility making noise. He's a retired Navy captain who commanded a ship. He's a former astronaut who flew multiple space missions. He's someone who actually served this country in genuinely dangerous roles roles for years before ever entering politics. He understands military culture from the inside. He knows what service members go through. He's been in command positions where he had to make life and death decisions. And he's also been in a position where he had to understand the limits of lawful orders. Watching someone with that specific background get labeled seditious for reminding troops of existing military law adds a real personal weight to this entire dispute. So here's what most people scrolling past the dramatized clips are actually missing. This isn't a story about some hidden sealed verdict against Trump getting exposed in a courtroom. It's a story about the Secretary of Defense trying to use the machinery of the Pentagon to punish a sitting senator for constitutionally protected political speech, and getting rebuked in exceptionally forceful terms by a federal judge, all happening within days of prosecutors also failing to secure a criminal indictment against that same senator for the same underlying conduct. That's a genuinely bigger, more alarming story than any invented courtroom scene could ever capture. Precisely because it's real, it's documented, and it's still ongoing. There's also important context worth understanding about how this fits into a much broader pattern involving Hegseth specifically. This wasn't happening in isolation from everything else going on with his tenure at the Pentagon. Around the same period, he was also dealing with intense scrutiny over the Signal scandal, the one where he shared detailed operational information about military strikes on an unsecured messaging app that accidentally included a journalist. He was discussing active military operations in a chat group that a reporter somehow ended up in. That's not a minor security breach. That's a profound failure of judgment from someone in charge of the nation's defense. Taken together, these controversies paint a consistent picture of someone repeatedly pushing the boundaries of his authority, whether that's handling classified information recklessly or trying to punish elected officials for speech he personally disagreed with. And the response to the Kelly ruling tells you something important about the broader pattern here. Rather than engaging with the substance of a federal judge's detailed constitutional analysis, Hegseth doubled down on the exact framing that the judge had just rejected, calling Kelly's protected speech sedition, even after the judge explained why that characterization was legally baseless. This suggests the entire effort was never really about a genuine legal dispute in the first place. It was a political messaging strategy aimed at supporters rather than a good faith attempt to win in court. When you lose and immediately declare that you're right anyway, you're not engaging with the legal system. You're performing for an audience. Let's break down what all of this actually means. Judge Leon's ruling represents a genuinely significant, forceful judicial rebuke of Hegseth's conduct, not some minor procedural footnote. 29 pages, unusually direct language. A Bush-appointed judge concluding clearly that Kelly's constitutional rights had been trampled. That's about as unambiguous as judicial condemnation gets, especially when it's aimed directly at a sitting cabinet secretary's official conduct rather than some vague policy disagreement. This was personal. This was direct. This was a federal judge telling the Secretary of Defense that he had violated the Constitution. The failed grand jury indictment matters just as much as the ruling itself, arguably even more. Prosecutors actually tried to bring criminal seditious conspiracy charges against two sitting senators over this exact same video. And even a grand jury, a body that typically indicts in the overwhelming majority of cases prosecutors bring before it, wasn't willing to go along with it. That's a genuine signal about how weak the underlying legal theory actually was. Coming from a body specifically designed to defer to prosecutors rather than push back against them, a refusal to indict is remarkable. It means that even with prosecutors making the case, even with the full weight of the Justice Department behind them, a group of ordinary citizens looked at the evidence and said no. This case connects to a much bigger concern about the chilling effect on speech more broadly, extending well beyond just Kelly personally. The friend of the court brief from former military officials warning that other service members were already self-censoring out of fear of similar retaliation points to exactly the kind of systemic harm First Amendment protections are specifically designed to prevent, one that extends to anyone watching how this case ultimately gets resolved. When people see that speaking out can lead to threats of demotion and pension cuts and criminal charges, they think twice. And that's precisely what the government can't be allowed to do. The First Amendment doesn't just protect speech that's popular or convenient. It protects speech that's controversial, speech that pushes back against power, speech that the government would rather not hear. So who actually benefits from all of this? In the short term, Kelly clearly benefits. He's secured a real binding legal victory that blocks his censure and demotion, at least for now, but the broader fight is far from over. Hegseth has already vowed to appeal, and Leon's ruling was only a preliminary injunction, not a final permanent resolution of the underlying case. That distinction matters enormously. It means the underlying legal fight over whether retired service members serving in Congress retain full First Amendment protections still has to play out completely through the appeals process before this becomes fully settled law. We're not at the end of this story. We're somewhere in the middle. For Hegseth and the administration, the calculation looks different. Even losing this specific preliminary round doesn't necessarily mean abandoning the broader strategy. Publicly framing the loss as an unfair, biased ruling, while immediately vowing an appeal, lets the administration continue signaling to its base that it's still fighting this fight, regardless of what any individual judge has actually concluded about the underlying constitutional questions involved. The audience for these statements isn't the court. It's the supporters who want to see the administration pushing back against perceived enemies. Whether the legal arguments hold up in court is almost secondary to the political messaging. Watch closely for how that appeal actually plays out, because Leon strongly suggested Kelly is likely to ultimately prevail on the full merits of his case, not just at this preliminary stage. The judge's language was so strong, so unequivocal, that it's hard to imagine a higher court reaching a different conclusion. But appeals courts are unpredictable, and there's always the possibility that a conservative appellate panel will find a way to narrow the ruling or support the administration's position. Watch for whether other retired service members emboldened by this ruling start speaking out more freely on similarly sensitive military and political topics. Since Leon's decision specifically protects that exact category of speech going forward, it creates a legal shield that other veterans can cite if they face similar retaliation. And watch closely for whether this same pattern shows up again with other retired officials or other members of Congress, because Kelly's case, while significant, may not be an isolated incident. The administration's willingness to test the boundaries of executive authority against political critics seems consistent across multiple contexts. If they tried this once and got slapped down, they might try it again in a different way, or they might target someone else. The underlying impulse to punish critics doesn't disappear just because one attempt fails. It just changes form. It's also worth watching how this specific episode affects Hegseth's own standing more broadly, given everything else happening around his tenure at the Pentagon during the same period. A federal judge explicitly ruling that he violated a sitting senator's constitutional rights using language. This direct adds another significant data point to an already growing list of controversies surrounding his leadership. Regardless of how any single one of those controversies gets resolved individually, the signal scandal, the Kelly censure, the broader pattern of controversial statements and actions, all of it contributes to a picture of someone whose judgment is increasingly being questioned. And there's a broader institutional question worth sitting with here too, one that extends well beyond just Hegseth or Kelly specifically. When a defense secretary tries to use the Pentagon's internal disciplinary authority to punish elected officials for political speech, it raises genuinely serious questions about civilian control of the military and the proper boundaries between executive branch power and congressional oversight. Leon's ruling reinforces those boundaries in this specific case, but the underlying tension over how much authority the executive branch can wield against its political critics, particularly ones with military backgrounds, is exactly the kind of question that tends to resurface again in different forms, regardless of how this particular case ultimately concludes. So, did Hegseth actually expose some sealed verdict against Trump that made a courtroom erupt the way that dramatic headline suggests? No, not even close. That specific claim doesn't correspond to anything that's actually happened in any real court proceeding. It's pure fiction. But did a federal judge issue a genuinely forceful 29-page ruling finding that Hegseth had violated a sitting senator's First Amendment rights using language sharp enough to quote Bob Dylan while doing it? Absolutely. That part is completely real, and it's honestly a far more significant, far more consequential story than any invented courtroom drama could ever capture. It's worth sitting with why that distinction actually matters, because it says something real about how these kinds of stories tend to spread. A fictional sealed verdict against Trump generates massive instant engagement, tapping directly into years of pent-up frustration and speculation about his various legal troubles. Meanwhile, the real story, a genuinely significant First Amendment ruling, protecting a sitting senator's right to speak freely, requires a bit more patience to actually understand, even though it carries real, lasting constitutional weight that will likely get cited in future cases involving retired service members and political speech for years to come. The dramatic headline gets the clicks, but the boring legal analysis actually matters. There's also a broader pattern worth remembering here, one that connects this specific ruling to a wider story about how this administration has approached dissent more generally. Whether it's threatening criminal charges against sitting senators, attempting demotions and pension cuts through Pentagon disciplinary channels, or publicly labeling protected political speech as sedition, the through line running across all of it is a consistent willingness to test the outer limits of executive authority against people who publicly criticize the administration. Judge Leon's ruling represents one specific documented instance where the courts push back forcefully against that pattern. But it's worth watching closely whether similar attempts continue showing up elsewhere, against other critics, in other contexts. Going forward, all right, that's it for this one. But keep a close eye on this story, because between Hegseth's promised appeal, the ongoing questions about how far this administration will go to punish political critics inside and outside the military, and the broader pattern of controversy surrounding Hegseth's leadership at the Pentagon, this fight over free speech and executive overreach is far from finished. We'll be watching closely to see exactly what happens next. Whether the appeals court upholds Leon's ruling, whether the administration tries another approach, whether other retired service members step forward to speak out now that they have legal protection, and whether this case ultimately becomes a landmark ruling on the First Amendment rights of veterans. The legal battle continues, the political implications are still unfolding, and the constitutional questions at the heart of this dispute aren't going anywhere.